Teach me how to ruin a powerful man, I begged the Empire's most dangerous alpha. He smirked and taught me every trick. He just didn't expect to become my very first victim. Welcome to Luna's Secret Library. On this channel, you can enjoy all sorts of romantic love stories. If you like my stories, please subscribe to my channel for more wonderful tales. The tightly laced corset dug relentlessly into my ribs, making every breath a physical battle. But physical pain was nothing compared to the cold desperation wrapping tightly around my heart. My name is Clara, and at 19, my beauty was the only currency my ruined family had left. Our grand historical estate was mortgaged to the hilt, and my father's gambling debts threatened to drown us all. In the ruthless aristocratic circles of the kingdom, an unmarried omega like me was merely a pawn to be traded. By the end of the winter social season, I would be auctioned off to a vile, wealthy old baron to clear our debts. Unless I managed to ensnare a powerful alpha of my own choosing first. The tragedy was that I knew absolutely nothing about the dark, seductive games men and women played in the shadows. I was raised in quiet innocence, entirely unequipped for the viciousness of the royal court. That was precisely why I was currently standing inside the sprawling, shadow-drenched estate of Duke Arthur. Arthur was the most feared alpha in the entire realm, a man whose reputation was built on ruthless dominance. The high society whispered his name with dread, calling him the Iron Duke. He possessed a striking, lethal kind of handsome, with sharp jawlines and eyes as cold as a frozen winter lake. The heavy, intoxicating scent of crushed pine needles, dark leather, and impending storm clouds radiated off him. It was an alpha pheromone so potent and overwhelming that it made my knees physically weak. Arthur did not court women. He consumed them for his own purposes and cast them aside without a backward glance. He was the ultimate predator, yet he was exactly the dark master I needed right now. I swallowed the dry lump of pure terror in my throat and forced myself to look directly into his icy blue eyes. "You are asking me to teach you the art of seduction?" Arthur asked, his baritone voice vibrating violently through the polished floorboards. He let out a low, mocking laugh that sent a sharp shiver racing down my spine. "A fragile little dove like you wouldn't survive a single hour in the wolves' den of the capital. You would be completely devoured before you even learned how to smile properly at a gentleman." I refused to look away, digging my fingernails into the soft silk of my skirts to hide my violently trembling hands. "I have absolutely nothing left to lose, Your Grace. If I fail to secure a wealthy mate, my life is essentially over anyway. Teach me how to be the beautiful flame that draws the moths to their inevitable deaths." A fleeting flicker of genuine surprise crossed Arthur's stoic, aristocratic features at my bold words. Slowly, he rose from his massive leather armchair, gracefully unfolding his towering, muscular frame. He stalked toward me with the terrifying, predatory grace of a large jungle cat cornering its prey. The sheer weight of his alpha aura pressed down on me, heavy, intoxicating, and impossibly warm against my skin. He began to circle me slowly, his heavy leather boots completely silent on the thick Persian rug. I felt his piercing gaze evaluating every single inch of me, dissecting my posture, my breathing, and my hidden fear. "You are undeniably beautiful, Clara," he murmured, his voice softer now, yet infinitely more dangerous to my sanity. "But in my ruthless world, physical beauty is remarkably cheap and easily forgotten. True power over an alpha does not come from merely having a pretty face or a slender waist. It comes from making him believe he is the grand hunter, right up until the exact moment the steel cage snaps shut on his neck." He stopped his pacing directly behind me, the intense heat of his tall body radiating through the thin fabric of my evening gown. I gasped sharply as his large, bare hand came to rest incredibly lightly on the sensitive skin of my nape. His skin was rough with warrior's calluses, yet his touch was shockingly gentle, almost reverent. A sudden, violent jolt of pure electricity shot down my spine, traveling straight to my very core. My breath hitched uncontrollably, and a soft, betraying whimper escaped my parted lips before I could stop it. His warm breath brushed against the delicate shell of my ear, sending a feverish flush across my cheeks and down my chest. "First lesson, my little dove," he whispered, his words a dark, velvety caress against my trembling skin. "Never let them smell your fear. Dominant alphas like me feed on the sweet scent of terror. You must swallow that panic down and replace it with absolute, undeniable desire." His large thumb moved slowly from my neck, deliberately tracing the delicate, vulnerable line of my jaw. He applied a gentle but firm pressure, forcing my head to tilt back until my eyes met his upside down. What I saw swimming in his frozen blue eyes stole the very breath directly from my lungs. The mocking coldness was completely gone, instantly replaced by a sudden, intense spark of raw, feral hunger. His dark pupils dilated rapidly before my eyes, expanding until they almost swallowed the icy blue irises entirely. For a single, suspended heartbeat, the terrifying, always in control Iron Duke looked completely unhinged. He looked at me not like a jaded teacher regarding a naive pupil, but like a starving man staring at an absolute feast. A thick, heavy silence stretched taut between us, heavily charged with an undeniable, dangerous romantic tension. Then, just as quickly as it had spectacularly appeared, the primal madness vanished from his expression. He ripped his hand away from my skin and stepped back abruptly, almost as if he had been badly burned by the contact. The sudden, shocking absence of his massive warmth left me shivering, desperately gasping for air in the center of the vast library. Arthur cleared his throat harshly, immediately turning his broad back to me and shoving his hands deep into his trouser pockets. His shoulders were strangely rigid, and I could see his chest heaving slightly beneath his perfectly tailored waistcoat. "I will teach you my methods," he finally said, his voice clipped, strained, and stripped of its former amusement. "But there is a very high price for my personal tutelage. You will use these skills I teach you to seduce and completely ruin Lord William, my greatest political rival in the House of Lords. You will bring me his deepest secrets, and in return, I will give you the wealth required to save your family's estate. Do we have a deal, Clara?" I stared at his tense back, my own heart still hammering violently against my aching ribs. I nodded slowly, my voice barely above a raspy whisper when I finally managed to speak. "We have a deal, Your Grace. I had come to this dark estate to learn how to trap a monster to save my own miserable life." But as the lingering, electric heat of his touch continued to burn against my skin, a terrifying realization dawned on me. My cold, calculating teacher might be the one in the most imminent danger of falling into a romantic trap. And as I looked at the powerful Duke, I wasn't entirely sure if I was the helpless prey, or if I had just become the hunter. The next 2 weeks inside Duke Arthur's sprawling estate were a grueling, exhausting descent into the dark psychology of seduction. He moved me into a lavish, velvet-draped guest suite, surrounding me with exquisite silk gowns that I could never afford. But this was certainly not an act of charity. I was merely a beautiful weapon he was meticulously forging to destroy his enemy. Our intense daily lessons took place in his private, dimly lit study, far away from the prying eyes of his household staff. Arthur taught me that true seduction was never about offering oneself, but about creating a maddening illusion of unattainable perfection. A powerful alpha like Lord William is incredibly bored by women who throw themselves directly at his feet, Arthur lectured coldly. He paced slowly around my seated figure, his dark, overwhelming presence constantly keeping my senses on razor-sharp alert. "You must become a beautiful puzzle he is utterly desperate to solve, a fragile bird he desperately wants to cage but simply cannot catch." He instructed me on the exact angle to tilt my head to make my slender neck appear impossibly vulnerable. He showed me how to flutter my eyelashes just enough to mimic nervous innocence while carefully hiding my cold, desperate calculation. "Control your breathing, Clara," he commanded one evening, stepping uncomfortably close to the back of my chair. "When a dominant man approaches you, your breath should hitch slightly, perfectly simulating the panicked flutter of frightened prey. To demonstrate, he leaned in abruptly from behind, his intoxicating scent of dark pine and impending storm overwhelming my senses. My breath hitched completely naturally, my heart suddenly hammering a frantic, terrifying rhythm against my tightly corseted ribs. Exactly like that, he whispered hoarsely, his icy blue eyes dropping to stare at my trembling lips for a fraction of a second. He pulled back sharply, clearing his throat and instantly rebuilding the impenetrable, icy wall of aristocratic indifference between us. I noted his sudden, almost panicked retreat, a small, dangerous seed of confidence finally taking root in my own mind. I was diligently learning how to manipulate dangerous men, but I was also observing the subtle, surprising cracks in my formidable master's armor. The ultimate test of my grueling training arrived with the grand midsummer ball hosted at the dazzling royal palace. The cavernous ballroom was a blinding sea of swirling silks, sparkling crystal chandeliers, and the suffocatingly heavy scents of wealthy alphas. I wore a breathtaking gown of midnight blue that clung tightly to my curves and left my shoulders entirely bare. Arthur had ruthlessly selected it himself, coldly stating it would make me look like a rare, priceless sapphire waiting to be stolen. My target, Lord William, was extremely easy to spot across the crowded room, constantly surrounded by a swarm of eager admirers. William was undeniably handsome in a polished, conventional way, but his charming smile held a cruel edge that immediately repulsed me. Remembering Arthur's strict instructions, I did not walk directly towards my prey, but instead moved gracefully toward the open terrace doors. I deliberately dropped my delicate lace fan just as I passed by William's immediate line of sight. I paused, glancing back over my bare shoulder with a perfectly executed look of startled, doe-eyed innocence. William stopped speaking mid-sentence, his gaze hooking onto me instantly like a hungry predator spotting a wounded fawn in the snow. He immediately broke away from his sycophantic circle, swooping down to retrieve my fan with a thoroughly predatory smirk on his face. "A truly beautiful lady should never lose her weapons," William said smoothly, handing the silk fan back to me. I lowered my eyelashes, forcing a delicate, shy blush to my cheeks just as my ruthless teacher had practiced with me countless times. "Thank you, my lord," I murmured, making absolutely sure my voice trembled slightly with feigned, delicate nervousness. "I am not used to such grand crowds, and I fear I am feeling quite overwhelmed by all of this." William puffed his chest up instantly, his alpha protective instincts rising exactly as Arthur had clinically predicted they would. "Allow me to offer you my personal protection in a dance, sweet creature," he insisted, smoothly slipping his arm around my waist. His possessive touch made my skin crawl with deep revulsion, but I forced a shy, remarkably grateful smile onto my lips. As William confidently led me onto the crowded dance floor, I allowed my gaze to quickly scan the perimeter of the magnificent room. I found Arthur immediately, standing completely motionless and half hidden in the deep shadows of a towering marble pillar. His handsome face was entirely unreadable, a stony, terrifying mask of absolute aristocratic indifference. But as William's hand tightened possessively on my waist, pulling me inappropriately closer against his chest, everything suddenly shifted. Even from all the way across the massive ballroom, I felt the terrifying, suffocating wave of Arthur's alpha pheromones spike violently. It was a dark, crushing pressure of absolute fury that made several nearby omegas gasp aloud and stumble in sheer terror. William faltered in his elegant steps, his own scent turning sour with sudden, inexplicable panic as he looked around wildly. Before I could even register the movement, Arthur was suddenly materializing right beside us like a furiously vengeful god of war. His normally icy blue eyes were almost entirely black, and his strong jaw was clenched so tightly I thought the bone might shatter. "Pardon the interruption, Lord William," Arthur said, his voice a deadly, vibrating rumble that physically shook the polished floorboards. "But Lady Clara explicitly promised this particular waltz to me." Without waiting for a reply, Arthur brutally snatched my gloved hand away from William's lingering grip. His large fingers dug possessively into my sensitive skin, burning hot with a barely contained, savage fury. He dragged me forcefully off the dance floor, completely ignoring the shocked whispers and scandalized stares of the entire high society. He didn't stop his furious march until he had pulled me out onto the dark, deserted balcony and slammed the heavy glass doors shut behind us. The cool night air hit my flushed, trembling skin, but it did absolutely nothing to soothe the radiating heat pouring off the furious Duke. He trapped me instantly against the stone balustrade, his large hands planting heavily on the stone on either side of my trapped waist. He was breathing incredibly hard, staring down at me with an intense, burning ferocity that made my knees genuinely weak. "You were doing perfectly," he snarled, his deep voice thick with a chaotic emotion I had never heard from him before. "You had him exactly where you wanted him, dangling helplessly on your little hook. So please tell me, Your Grace," I challenged, bravely tilting my chin up to meet his furious gaze, refusing to back down. "If I was executing your lesson so flawlessly, why did you feel the need to ruin the trap?" Arthur stared down at me, his broad chest heaving, his eyes burning with a dark, territorial fire that terrified and thrilled me simultaneously. He slowly raised his hand, his trembling fingers hovering just a millimeter away from the soft skin of my cheek. He didn't answer my direct question, but the suffocatingly possessive scent of his pheromones told me exactly what his pride stubbornly refused to admit. The cold, calculated, master hunter had just experienced his very first, agonizing taste of uncontrollable, blinding jealousy. And I realized, with a sudden rush of intoxicating power, that my first successful hunt of the night wasn't Lord William at all. The heavy silence on the dimly lit balcony was completely shattered by Arthur's ragged, uneven breathing. He stared down at me with those burning, darkened eyes, his massive body still caging me against the cold stone. For a single, breathless second, I honestly thought the Iron Duke was going to violently kiss me right there in the moonlight. Instead, he abruptly dropped his hands from the balustrade and took a sharp, staggering step backward. He ran a trembling hand through his perfectly styled dark hair, entirely destroying his usual impeccable aristocratic image. "You were rushing the tactical operation," he finally lied, his deep voice painfully tight as he tried to regain his composure. "William is a notoriously paranoid predator, and your eager compliance would have eventually made him highly suspicious." I smoothed down the ruffled silk of my midnight blue gown, refusing to let him see how badly my own hands were shaking. "I was merely following your exact instructions on how to perfectly mimic a frightened, grateful prey," I replied softly. I took a deliberately slow step closer to him, intentionally invading his personal space and testing his fragile self-control. "Or perhaps, Your Grace, you simply could not stomach the sight of another alpha touching what rightfully belongs to you." His icy blue eyes flashed with a sudden, violent warning, his broad chest expanding as he took a sharp, deep breath. "Do not flatter yourself into thinking this is some pathetic romantic parlor game, Clara," he snarled viciously. "You are a paid operative in my political war, and I will absolutely not allow William to break my most valuable weapon. We are leaving this absurd ball immediately," he commanded, turning on his heel and striding back toward the dark shadows. He did not offer me his arm, but his suffocating, fiercely protective alpha scent aggressively cleared a path for us through the courtyard. The midnight carriage ride back to his sprawling country estate was an agonizing exercise in absolute, suffocating silence. The enclosed leather space was overwhelmingly thick with the intoxicating smell of dark pine and his lingering, feral frustration. I sat rigidly on the plush velvet cushions, stealing secret glances at his tense jawline illuminated by the passing street lamps. He kept his gaze fixed stubbornly on the dark window, refusing to acknowledge the dangerous electricity crackling between us. When we finally arrived back at the silent, imposing mansion, he dismissed me to my bedchambers with a single, curt nod. I barely slept a wink that night, my skin still burning intensely from the phantom memory of his rough, possessive grip. The real complication arrived the very next morning, carried by a royal messenger on a gleaming silver platter. A massive, ostentatious arrangement of incredibly rare white blood roses was delivered directly to my private guest suite. Nestled among the fragrant, velvety petals was a handwritten note sealed with Lord William's heavy, golden aristocratic crest. It was a formal, highly presumptuous invitation to join him for a private afternoon tea at his secluded country estate. I carried the heavy, dripping bouquet down the sweeping grand staircase and walked directly into Arthur's sunlit private study. He was sitting rigidly behind his massive mahogany desk, reviewing political documents with his usual cold, calculated efficiency. He looked up at my unexpected entrance, his piercing eyes immediately zeroing in on the extravagant flowers in my arms. The temperature in the large room seemed to drop 10 freezing degrees in a single, terrifying instant. Lord William works incredibly fast, I announced quietly, placing the beautiful roses directly onto his perfectly neat desk. He wishes for me to visit his private country estate completely unchaperoned this coming Thursday. Arthur stared at the innocent white blooms as if they were a cluster of highly venomous snakes preparing to strike him. He slowly stood up, the heavy leather of his chair creaking loudly in the suddenly oppressive silence of the grand study. Without speaking a single word, he reached across the polished desk and violently swept the entire priceless bouquet onto the floor. The heavy crystal vase shattered into 100 glittering pieces, scattering cold water and crushed petals across the Persian rug. I gasped aloud and took a startled step back, genuinely shocked by his sudden, entirely uncharacteristic display of raw violence. "You will absolutely not go to his private estate," Arthur growled, stepping around the massive desk to stalk toward me. "He is notorious for forcibly marking innocent omegas who foolishly agree to meet him in secluded, undefended locations." I bravely held my ground, raising my chin defiantly even as my heart hammered a frantic, terrified rhythm against my ribs. "But isn't this exactly what we originally wanted, to get close enough to uncover his hidden political secrets? I am fully prepared to handle him, Arthur," I insisted boldly, deliberately dropping his formal title to test him further. My audacious use of his first name made his eyes darken instantly, his pupils dilating with a sudden, predatory hunger. He aggressively closed the remaining distance between us in 2 long strides, backing me smoothly up against the heavy wooden door. "You have absolutely no idea how to physically handle a violently aroused alpha," he whispered darkly, towering impressively over me. "Sweet words and coy smiles will not save you when a ruthless man like William finally decides to drop his charming mask." He suddenly slammed his large hands flat against the thick wood on either side of my head, caging me completely. "If he forcefully grabs you exactly like this," Arthur demonstrated, his voice dropping to a harsh, guttural whisper, "what is your defense? If he violently presses his heavy weight against you and uses his pheromones to paralyze your limbs, how will you escape?" He stepped flush against me, his hard, muscular chest pressing heavily against my soft, tightly corseted curves. A pathetic, whimpering gasp tore its way out of my throat, completely unbidden and utterly impossible for me to suppress. His intoxicating scent washed over me like a massive tidal wave, short-circuiting my rational thoughts and turning my blood to liquid fire. I was supposed to be learning critical self-defense, but my traitorous body was instantly melting into his overwhelmingly dominant embrace. I looked up blindly into his mesmerizing eyes, seeing the agonizing, desperate war between his iron discipline and his primal desire. His heated gaze dropped slowly to my parted lips, holding there with a burning intensity that made the entire room spin dangerously. He leaned in incredibly slowly, his warm, mint-scented breath ghosting tantalizingly across my trembling, waiting mouth. I instinctively closed my eyes, unconsciously leaning up on my tiptoes to willingly meet the devastating kiss I knew was finally coming. But at the very last possible fraction of a second, Arthur released a harsh, tortured groan and forcefully pushed himself away. He turned his broad back to me again, gripping the smooth edge of his desk so tightly his large knuckles turned stark white. "You will write back to Lord William today and formally accept his dangerous invitation," Arthur commanded coldly, his voice completely stripped of emotion. But you will absolutely not be going to his secluded estate alone, Clara. I will be hiding deeply in the shadows of his private gardens, waiting for the exact moment he makes his fatal mistake. He stubbornly refused to look at me, but his wildly fluctuating, distressed scent betrayed the absolute chaos storming inside his proud heart. I left the ruined, flower-strewn study with trembling legs, knowing completely that my cold, calculating master was rapidly losing his mind. He was desperately trying to keep our relationship strictly professional, treating me merely as a tactical weapon in his war. Yet every single time he looked at me now, I could clearly hear the heavy iron chains of his legendary self-control snapping one by one. Lord William was undeniably a terrible threat, but the most dangerous man in my entire life was currently standing right inside this study. I walked up the grand staircase to write my fateful reply, a victorious, wicked little smile playing softly on my lips. The legendary Iron Duke had confidently promised to teach me exactly how to ruin a powerful man. I simply never expected my very first, most spectacular victim to be the impenetrable Duke himself. Thursday afternoon arrived with a sky the color of bruised plums and the promise of a violent summer storm. I sat inside the swaying carriage as it rolled through the heavy wrought iron gates of Lord William's remote country estate. The towering stone manor was completely isolated, surrounded by miles of dense, impenetrable dark forests. My heart hammered a frantic rhythm against my ribs, but my mind was completely cold and utterly focused. I knew Arthur was out there somewhere in the shadows, tracking my every move like a lethal guardian angel. A polite but stone-faced butler escorted me directly into a lavishly decorated, stiflingly warm drawing room. William was waiting by the crackling fireplace, swirling a glass of amber liquid with a deeply predatory smile. He dismissed the silent servants with a careless wave of his hand, locking the heavy oak doors behind them. The ominous click of the metal lock echoed loudly in the sudden, suffocating silence of the grand room. "My beautiful, fragile Clara," William purred, setting his crystal glass down and walking slowly toward me. He did not even bother to offer me tea or engage in the usual polite aristocratic small talk. His disguise of the charming gentleman vanished instantly, replaced by the raw, greedy hunger of a dominant alpha. "I have been thinking about your sweet scent since the very moment you dropped your fan at the ball." He stepped uncomfortably close, his sour, overpowering pheromones deliberately flaring to trigger my natural omega submission. My knees trembled violently against my will, but I forced myself to stand tall and maintain eye contact. "You are being much too forward, my lord," I said softly, injecting exactly the right amount of terrified hesitation into my voice. I assumed we were merely going to enjoy a quiet afternoon discussing the beautiful gardens. William laughed, a harsh, ugly sound that made my skin crawl with genuine, undeniable revulsion. "No one comes to this isolated estate merely to look at the blooming roses, you naive little creature." He lunged suddenly, his large, heavy hands gripping my bare shoulders with a bruising, painful force. I let out a sharp cry of genuine alarm as he forcefully shoved me backward against the cold stone wall. His heavy body pinned me completely, trapping my desperate struggles just as Arthur had perfectly predicted. "Do not fight me, Clara," William growled, burying his face roughly into the sensitive crook of my neck. "Once I mark you, your debts will vanish, and you will learn to enjoy the wealth I can provide." I raised my hands to push aggressively against his chest, preparing to use the physical escape tactics my master taught me. But before I could even twist my waist, the massive glass window across the room shattered into 1,000 spectacular pieces. A terrifying roar of pure, unadulterated alpha fury ripped through the sudden chaos of the drawing room. Arthur did not just enter the room, he exploded into it like a vengeful god bringing absolute destruction. His dark hair was wildly windblown, his formal cravat undone, and his blue eyes were completely black with murder. The overwhelming, terrifying pressure of his enraged pheromones hit the room like a physical shockwave. William choked violently, physically stumbling backward as he released me to clutch desperately at his own throat. Arthur did not hesitate for a single fraction of a second as he lunged across the shattered glass. He grabbed William by his expensive velvet lapels and slammed him brutally into the heavy wooden mantelpiece. The sickening crack of bone hitting stone echoed loudly over the roaring flames of the fireplace. "If you ever touch her again, I will slowly tear you to pieces," Arthur snarled, his voice a demonic, vibrating rumble. He struck William across the jaw with a vicious, heavily ringed fist, sending the younger alpha crashing to the floor. William groveled pitifully in the glass shards, his nose bleeding profusely and his arrogant pride utterly shattered. Arthur stood over the whimpering man, his broad chest heaving, his large fists dripping with fresh, dark blood. He looked like a beautiful, terrifying monster completely stripped of his civilized aristocratic restraints. Slowly, Arthur turned his dark, wild gaze away from his broken enemy and locked his eyes directly onto me. He crossed the room in 3 massive strides, his heavy boots crunching loudly over the broken window glass. Without saying a single word, he wrapped his strong, blooded arms around my trembling waist and pulled me flush against him. He buried his face deeply into my hair, inhaling my scent with a desperate, starving kind of madness. I felt his massive, powerful body shaking uncontrollably against mine, completely overwhelmed by the terrifying adrenaline of his possessive rage. He did not look like a cool, calculating political mastermind anymore. He simply looked like a desperate man who had almost lost the only thing he actually cared about. Arthur scooped me up effortlessly into his strong arms, completely ignoring the groaning William on the floor. He carried me out of the ruined drawing room, kicking the locked oak doors open with a single, violent thrust of his boot. We bypassed the terrified servants in the hallway and marched straight out into the raging summer storm. He tossed me gently into the plush interior of his waiting carriage before climbing in and slamming the door shut. The rain hammered violently against the wooden roof, mirroring the absolute chaos exploding in the small, enclosed space. Arthur sat directly across from me, his breathing ragged, his bloody hands resting heavily on his knees. I reached out with trembling fingers, offering a clean white lace handkerchief to gently wipe his bruised knuckles. The moment my soft skin touched his, a dangerous, electric spark ignited between us. Arthur snatched my wrist instantly, his grip tight but incredibly careful not to actually bruise my skin. With a sudden, forceful tug, he pulled me straight off my seat and firmly onto his muscular lap. I gasped sharply as my hands landed flat against his hard, heaving chest, my face mere inches from his. "You were supposed to wait for my signal," he gritted out, his dark eyes blazing with a mixture of fury and overwhelming relief. "He touched you before I could properly breach the perimeter, and I nearly lost my damn mind. You arrived exactly on time, my fierce protector," I whispered softly, refusing to look away from his intense, burning gaze. My bold words completely shattered the final, fragile remnants of his ironclad aristocratic self-control. His hands slid roughly up the back of my neck, tangling deeply in my elaborate, pinned-up hair. "I am not your protector, Clara," he growled darkly, his lips hovering an agonizing millimeter above mine. "I am the selfish, jealous monster who is going to keep you entirely for himself." And as the carriage rolled violently through the pouring rain, the Iron Duke finally stopped fighting his instincts and claimed my mouth. It was not a gentle, polite kiss born of aristocratic courtship or polite society rules. It was a fierce, punishing demand that tasted of copper blood, dark pine, and years of repressed, agonizing desire. He devoured my mouth with a starving intensity, demanding absolute submission and offering everything in return. I melted completely against his hard body, tangling my fingers eagerly into his damp, wind-blown dark hair. The cold, calculating tutor who had taught me the cynical rules of the seduction game was entirely gone. In his place was a fiercely possessive alpha who had completely surrendered to the intoxicating magic of his own student. I kissed him back with equal, desperate fervor, letting him taste my total, undeniable victory in this silent war. My ruined family and the looming financial debts no longer mattered in the suffocating, glorious heat of his embrace. I had successfully played the most dangerous game in the entire kingdom, and I had boldly claimed the ultimate prize. He groaned deeply into my mouth, his large hands mapping the delicate curves of my waist with feverish, urgent devotion. The beautiful trap had finally closed with a resounding snap, but neither of us cared who had actually caught whom. Because in the dark, rain-swept carriage, the untouchable Iron Duke had finally fallen helplessly and beautifully in love. The violent rainstorm continued to lash against the carriage roof as we finally pulled into the Duke's courtyard. Arthur did not release his punishing grip on my waist even as the horses drew to a complete, shuddering halt. His chest heaved against mine, his intoxicating scent of dark pine now thoroughly laced with absolute, feral desperation. I carefully pushed against his broad shoulders, breaking our heated kiss just enough to catch my ragged breath. "The lesson is over, Your Grace," I whispered softly against his swollen lips, deliberately testing his fragile, newfound surrender. A low, dangerous growl vibrated deep within his throat at my sudden, bold attempt to re-establish our professional boundaries. He buried his face into the curve of my neck, inhaling my sweet omega scent as if it were oxygen. "You do not get to call me Your Grace anymore, Clara," he commanded, his deep voice rough with raw emotion. "You have completely ruined my sanity, and I will be damned if I let you walk away now." I gently cupped his handsome, bruised face, staring directly into those beautiful, wildly unhinged blue eyes. "But I am still a ruined aristocrat destined for the auction block," I reminded him cruelly, watching the realization hit him. "My father's crippling gambling debts remain unpaid, and the dreadful old baron still expects his purchased bride by winter." The mere mention of another man claiming me caused a terrifying, violent tremor to rack Arthur's massive frame. His pupils dilated rapidly, the darkness almost swallowing his blue irises as the possessive alpha instinct violently took over. "No one is ever going to touch you again," Arthur swore, his voice a lethal, vibrating promise in the darkness. He practically kicked the carriage door open, effortlessly lifting me into his arms and carrying me through the pouring rain. We bypassed the shocked staff completely, Arthur ignoring every protocol as he marched directly toward his private chambers. He kicked his heavy oak bedroom door shut with a resounding slam, finally setting me down gently on his massive bed. The room was bathed in the warm, flickering glow of the massive fireplace, casting dancing shadows over his muscular physique. He stripped off his ruined, blood-stained coat and threw it carelessly onto the floor, running a hand through his damp hair. "I spent my entire life building an impenetrable fortress around my heart and my political empire," Arthur confessed quietly. "I genuinely believed that emotional attachments were simply foolish, dangerous weaknesses meant only for lesser, pathetic men." He walked slowly toward the edge of the bed, dropping heavily onto his knees right in front of me. The sight of the kingdom's most terrifying, powerful predator kneeling willingly before me stole the breath right from my lungs. He took my trembling, delicate hands in his massive, bruised ones, pressing a desperately tender kiss to my knuckles. "But you walked into my study with your terrified doe eyes and completely dismantled me piece by piece. You used my own ruthless teachings against me, and I fell directly into the beautiful trap you so flawlessly set." I looked down at the legendary Iron Duke, feeling a massive surge of overwhelming, intoxicating power wash over my soul. "I was only fighting for my very survival, Arthur," I murmured, my voice trembling with sudden, genuine emotion. He reached up to gently wipe a stray raindrop from my cheek, his touch shockingly gentle despite his terrifying strength. "Your fight is completely over now, my beautiful, clever little hunter." He stood up abruptly, his sudden, decisive movement radiating an overwhelming aura of absolute, undisputed authority. "Rest here tonight, Clara, because tomorrow morning, everything in your entire world is going to permanently change." He did not attempt to touch me further, proving his immense self-control by walking out and locking the door behind him. I collapsed onto his pillows, surrounded entirely by his heavy, protective scent, and finally slept a dreamless, safe sleep. When I awoke the next morning, the bright summer sun was streaming warmly through the tall, leaded glass windows. A timid maid brought me a fresh, luxurious day dress and whispered that the Duke was waiting for me downstairs. I descended the grand marble staircase, my heart pounding with nervous anticipation as I approached his sunlit private study. Arthur was standing by the massive mahogany desk, dressed impeccably in a crisp, dark suit that accentuated his broad shoulders. He looked incredibly calm, but the intense, burning heat in his blue eyes betrayed the dangerous predator lurking just beneath. He pushed a thick, heavy stack of official parchment papers across the polished desk toward me. "What is all of this?" I asked, my voice barely above a raspy whisper as I stared at the documents. "That is the official, legally binding cancellation of every single debt your foolish father has ever incurred," Arthur stated smoothly. I gasped loudly, my hands flying up to cover my mouth in sheer, unadulterated shock at his impossible words. "I bought them all last night, from every single creditor in the kingdom, and then I burned the original ledgers." He stepped around the desk, invading my personal space with that heavy, intoxicating scent of pine and absolute dominance. "The vile baron who wished to purchase you has suddenly decided to permanently relocate to another continent. He found my nighttime visit and my friendly, quiet suggestions highly persuasive regarding his immediate travel plans." Tears of overwhelming relief welled up instantly in my eyes, finally releasing the suffocating terror of my impending ruin. "You saved me," I choked out, a single, hot tear slipping down my cheek before I could quickly brush it away. Arthur reached out and caught the tear with his thumb, his gaze dropping to my lips with that familiar, starving hunger. "I did not do this out of the goodness of my heart, my sweet, naive Clara," he whispered darkly. He produced one final, crisp white document from his breast pocket and laid it carefully on top of the cancelled debts. "This is a royal marriage contract, drawn up by my personal lawyers and already signed by my own hand. I have completely neutralized your enemies, but the terrifying price for your ultimate freedom is me. You will marry me by the end of this very week, and you will become the Duchess of my entire empire." He leaned in, pressing his warm, firm lips against my ear as a wicked, triumphant shiver shot straight down my spine. "You successfully seduced the monster, my love, and now the monster is never, ever going to let you go." The rapid, dizzying speed of our wedding preparations sent absolute shockwaves through the entire kingdom. Exactly 1 week after he bought my freedom, Arthur hosted our grand engagement gala at the Royal Opera House. He draped me in a breathtakingly heavy gown of spun gold and crimson, declaring I was the new queen of his empire. A massive, flawless diamond the size of a quail's egg rested heavily against my chest, serving as a stark warning to all other alphas. Arthur was briefly detained by the king's ministers, leaving me to make my grand entrance into the gilded hall entirely alone. The sudden hush that fell over the magnificent, crowded room was thick with vicious jealousy and malicious curiosity. The aristocratic vultures were eagerly waiting to tear apart the poor, bankrupt girl who had somehow ensnared the terrifying Iron Duke. I kept my chin perfectly level and my gaze delightfully cold, executing the impenetrable mask Arthur had painstakingly taught me. It did not take long for the first desperate predator to reveal herself from the sea of glittering silk gowns. Lady Beatrice, the notoriously venomous younger sister of Lord William, blocked my path with a sickeningly sweet smile. She was accompanied by a vicious little flock of high society omegas, all wielding their feathered fans like tiny daggers. "My dear Clara, what an absolute miracle to see you dressed in something other than your family's pathetic rags," Beatrice sneered loudly. Her shrill voice was deliberately calibrated to carry across the massive marble foyer, drawing a large circle of eager onlookers. "We all heard the tragic rumors about your father's catastrophic debts, and we were terrified you would end up on the freezing streets. Or worse, forced to sell yourself to my brother for a few miserable gold coins," she added with a wicked, triumphant laugh. A collective, scandalous gasp rippled rapidly through the gathered crowd at her blatant, unforgivable public insult. 2 weeks ago, such a brutal public humiliation would have sent me fleeing from the room in absolute, weeping terror. But I was no longer the frightened little doe who had nervously begged the dangerous Duke for survival lessons. I had successfully hunted the most lethal predator in the realm, and these pathetic little birds were nothing to me now. I did not flinch, nor did I allow a single trace of defensive anger to corrupt my perfectly smooth features. I am profoundly touched by your deep concern for my finances, Lady Beatrice, I replied, my voice dangerously soft and sweet. However, I find it incredibly amusing that you wish to discuss my debts while your own brother is currently hiding in the countryside. I took a slow, deliberate step forward, aggressively invading her personal space just as Arthur always did to assert total dominance. Perhaps you should spend less time worrying about my wardrobe and more time finding a competent surgeon for William's shattered jaw. Beatrice paled instantly, the malicious smile dropping from her heavily powdered face in a state of absolute, terrified shock. The surrounding crowd erupted into frantic, hushed whispers as the scandalous truth of William's brutal beating finally leaked out. How dare you speak to me with such insolence, you penniless little whore? Beatrice shrieked, completely losing her aristocratic composure. She raised her gloved hand high into the air, fully intending to strike my face in front of the entire royal court. I did not even bother to blink, knowing with absolute, unshakable certainty what was about to happen next. Before her hand could even begin its violent descent, the heavy brass doors of the opera house violently burst open. A suffocating, terrifying wave of enraged alpha pheromones crashed into the crowded room like a physical, crushing tidal wave. The sheer, oppressive weight of the dark pine scent drove half the room to their trembling knees in immediate, instinctual submission. Arthur strode through the grand archway, looking like a furious, beautiful god of war descending upon a battlefield of pathetic mortals. His icy blue eyes immediately locked onto Beatrice's raised hand, his handsome face contorting into a mask of pure, murderous rage. The crowd desperately parted for him, scrambling over each other like terrified rats fleeing from a massive, roaring fire. He did not yell, but his deadly, heavy silence was infinitely more terrifying than any loud threat could ever possibly be. He reached us in mere seconds, his massive hand shooting out to catch Beatrice's delicate wrist with bone-crushing force. The venomous woman let out a pathetic, whimpering cry as the Duke squeezed her arm until she dropped to her knees in pure agony. If you ever raise your hand toward my Duchess again, I will personally ensure your entire bloodline is erased from history, Arthur whispered. He shoved her away with intense, absolute disgust, turning his back on the trembling noblewoman as if she were literal garbage. The terrifying, feral monster vanished completely the exact second his intense, burning gaze finally met mine. He removed his heavy, gold-embroidered evening cloak and wrapped it protectively around my bare shoulders, shielding me from the world. In front of the stunned, completely silent aristocracy, the legendary Iron Duke bent down and gently adjusted the hem of my gown. It was an act of such profound, public servitude that several older, proud duchesses actually gasped aloud in pure disbelief. Forgive my delay, my absolute queen, Arthur murmured, loudly enough for every single terrified vulture in the room to hear. The king required my signature to officially strip Lord William of all his remaining noble titles and stolen land holdings. Another violent shockwave of panic rippled through Beatrice's cronies as they realized the absolute, total destruction of their patron. Arthur slowly stood up, wrapping his strong arm possessively around my waist and pulling me flush against his hard side. He swept his icy, dead gaze across the terrified sea of aristocrats, his alpha aura demanding absolute, unquestioning obedience. Let it be known from this night forward that Claro is the soul, beating heart of my entire empire. Any disrespect directed toward her is a direct declaration of war against me, and I take absolutely no prisoners. He looked down at me, his eyes softening into a pool of raw, unapologetic devotion that stole my breath entirely. Shall we show them how a true predator claims his territory, my love? He asked, a wicked, breathtaking smirk playing on his lips. I smiled back, wrapping my hands proudly around his muscular arm as we completely owned the grand, silent room. The student had not only mastered the ultimate game of seduction, but I had successfully weaponized the most dangerous teacher in the world. The carriage ride back to the sprawling estate was wrapped in a suffocating, heavy silence that felt entirely different from our previous battles. We had absolutely destroyed our enemies tonight, yet the victorious Duke sitting beside me suddenly looked incredibly defeated. When we finally retreated to the absolute privacy of his massive bedchamber, the heavy oak doors clicked shut with an ominous finality. The heavy velvet curtains were drawn tightly against the howling night wind, sealing us securely in our own private, shadowed universe. Arthur did not immediately pull me into his arms like the starving, possessive beast he had been just a few hours ago. Instead, he stood by the roaring marble fireplace, his broad back turned to me as he slowly unbuttoned his gold-embroidered waistcoat. The terrifying alpha aura that had violently brought the entire aristocracy to their knees was now completely, unnervingly absent. He looked like a massive, battle-scarred warrior who had just realized his most important war was actually completely unwinnable. I watched him quietly from the center of the lavish room, the heavy diamond necklace around my throat suddenly feeling like a beautiful, freezing chain. You executed your role with absolute, terrifying perfection tonight, Clara, he finally said, his deep voice painfully hollow and exhausted. You smiled exactly when you were supposed to, and you looked at me with the perfect, flawless illusion of absolute adoration. He turned around slowly to face me, and the raw, unmasked agony swimming in his icy blue eyes completely shattered my heart. You learned every single lesson I taught you about emotional manipulation, and you are playing the part of the devoted Duchess flawlessly. He took a slow, heavy step toward me, the flickering firelight casting deep, tragic shadows across his handsome, angular face. But that is exactly the agonizing problem I am now facing, my beautiful, terribly clever little bird. I taught you entirely too well how to perfectly fake your emotions in order to survive a ruthless world of monsters. He stopped just inches away from me, his massive chest rising and falling with a ragged, uneven breath that sounded alarmingly like a sob. Now, I look at your beautiful face and I am completely, terrifyingly unable to tell what is actually real anymore. Did you kiss me in that carriage because you truly wanted me, or because I was simply the strongest shield available to protect you? The sheer vulnerability pouring out of the most dangerous man in the kingdom left me absolutely, completely speechless. This was the legendary Iron Duke, a ruthless man who casually broke kings and destroyed powerful empires without a single ounce of hesitation. Yet here he was, standing before me with his entire soul stripped bare, bleeding out from an invisible, agonizing emotional wound. He reached into his dark trouser pocket and pulled out a small, incredibly ancient velvet box, flicking it open with a trembling thumb. Inside rested a massive, breathtakingly intricate sapphire ring surrounded by blood-red rubies, heavily steeped in centuries of violent history. This is the ancient signet ring of the ruling Duchess, worn by my mother and every single powerful matriarch before her, he whispered. He gently took my left hand, his large, rough fingers shaking visibly as he slowly slid the heavy, cold ring onto my finger. It officially grants you absolute, unquestionable control over my entire fortune, my private armies, and my very life. He didn't let go of my hand, instead gripping it tightly and bringing my knuckles up to press firmly against his fiercely beating heart. I forced you into this sudden marriage to save you from a monster, only to selfishly trap you in the gilded cage of an even bigger one. Before I could even process his heartbreaking words, Arthur reached down to his tall leather boot and unsheathed a wicked, gleaming silver dagger. I gasped in genuine terror, instinctively trying to pull my hand back, but he held onto me with an unyielding, desperate grip. He forcefully pressed the intricately carved bone handle of the deadly blade directly into my small, trembling palm. Then, with absolute, terrifying conviction, he grabbed my hand and pressed the razor-sharp tip of the dagger precisely against his own chest. I cannot survive the agonizing torture of possessing your beautiful body while knowing your heart secretly hates me, he confessed, a single hot tear escaping his eye. If you are only staying with me out of desperate gratitude or lingering fear, I am begging you to just end my miserable existence right now. Push the blade in, Clara, and you will instantly inherit everything, completely free to live your life without this suffocating cage. My breath hitched violently in my throat, my wide eyes staring into the dark, desperate depths of his shattered, beautiful soul. He was absolutely not testing me, and he was certainly not playing another cynical game of psychological manipulation. The ruthless predator who had systematically taught me how to ruin dangerous men had just handed me the ultimate weapon to destroy him completely. He was willingly offering himself up as the final, willing sacrifice on the bloody, dramatic altar of our dangerous courtship. The cold, heavy metal of the dagger trembled violently in my hand, matching the sudden, chaotic realization exploding brightly within my own mind. I looked at his desperate, tear-stained face, and the last, stubborn walls protecting my own guarded heart violently crumbled to fine dust. I did not want his massive, blood-soaked fortune, and I certainly did not want the lonely, freezing freedom of a wealthy widow's life without him. I let out a broken, tearful sob, dropping the dangerous silver dagger so it clattered loudly and harmlessly against the polished marble floor. Without a single second of hesitation, I threw my arms forcefully around his thick neck and pulled his handsome head down to mine. I crashed my lips against his in a desperate, bruising kiss that contained absolutely no calculation, no strategy, and no practiced lies. It was the raw, undeniable truth of a woman who had accidentally fallen completely, helplessly in love with her dark, terrifying savior. Arthur let out a shuddering, broken groan against my mouth, his massive arms wrapping around me like iron bands to crush me against his chest. He kissed me back with the frantic, starving desperation of a dying man who had just been handed the miraculous elixir of eternal life. I am not acting, Arthur, I cried out passionately against his lips, my own tears mixing violently with his as our frantic breaths completely mingled. I do not care about the vast fortune, I do not want the grand empire, I only want the brilliant, foolish man who bought my debts just to save my life. You are absolutely not my cage, you are my ultimate sanctuary, and I love you with every single shattered piece of my soul. The fierce, possessive growl that tore from his throat was a sound of pure, unadulterated victory and absolute emotional salvation. His large hands tangled desperately in my elaborate updo, sending dozens of expensive diamond hairpins scattering blindly across the dark Persian rugs. He worshipped my skin with a frantic, burning devotion, murmuring broken prayers of endless gratitude against my jawline and my flushed throat. Every single trembling touch was a desperate question, and every single breathless kiss I returned was my absolute, undeniable answer. The scent of burning cedar from the fireplace mingled heavily with his intoxicating alpha pheromones, wrapping securely around me like a warm, protective blanket. I could feel the frantic, violent beating of his heart against my chest, a stark, beautiful contrast to his usual terrifying, calculated calm. He swept me entirely off my feet, carrying me toward the massive canopy bed not as a conqueror claiming his prize, but as a devoted worshipper finally finding his true religion. The dangerous, twisted game of seductive manipulation was officially, permanently over, and we had both miraculously, beautifully won. The morning of our royal wedding dawned with a brilliant, golden sunrise that completely chased away the last lingering shadows of my past. Arthur had ruthlessly commanded an army of the kingdom's finest artisans to transform the ancient Grand Cathedral into a breathtaking floral paradise. Millions of pristine white roses and delicate silver orchids cascaded wildly from the towering Gothic arches, filling the cavernous space with a dizzying, sweet perfume. He had absolutely forbidden the strict, exhausting traditional ceremonies that usually forced aristocratic brides to stand for agonizing hours before the actual vows. My Duchess will not be treated like a prize horse on display for these pathetic vultures, he had coldly informed the panicked archbishop just yesterday. Instead, I was pampered in the utmost luxurious privacy of the Duke's private estate right up until the exact moment the massive royal bells began to chime. My magnificent wedding gown was a true masterpiece of priceless silk, intricate silver lacework, and thousands of tiny, glittering diamonds that caught the morning light. The heavy, sweeping train trailed for yards behind me, requiring 6 incredibly nervous, high-ranking noble maidens to carry it with trembling hands. As the massive oak doors of the cathedral slowly swung open, a profound, absolute silence instantly fell over the massive sea of assembled aristocrats. Every single powerful lord and jealous lady in the kingdom stood up immediately, their heads bowing in forced, undeniable respect as I began my long walk down the aisle. I kept my chin held high, radiating the quiet, untouchable confidence that my dark, brilliant tutor had so painstakingly drilled into my very soul. But the moment my eyes locked onto Arthur standing at the grand altar, the entire crowded room simply ceased to exist for me. He looked like a devastatingly handsome prince ripped straight from a dangerous fairy tale, dressed in his formal, midnight blue military uniform dripping with golden medals. The terrifying, cold mask of the legendary Iron Duke was completely gone, replaced by a look of such overwhelming, naked devotion that it literally stole my breath. His icy blue eyes were warm and intensely bright, tracking my every single step with a fierce, possessive hunger that made my skin flush beneath my delicate veil. I could heavily feel the potent, intoxicating wave of his dark pine pheromones washing over the congregation, fiercely claiming me in front of the entire known world. When I finally reached the massive marble altar, he did not politely wait for my father figure to formally hand me over according to archaic tradition. Arthur impatiently stepped down 2 steps, his large hands reaching out to gently but firmly take my trembling fingers into his warm, solid grasp. He carefully lifted the heavy, diamond-encrusted veil from my face, his breath catching audibly in his throat as he gazed down at me. "You are the most breathtaking creature God has ever allowed to walk this earth," he whispered roughly, his deep voice vibrating straight into my heart. The elderly archbishop began the ancient, sacred rites, his fragile voice echoing loudly across the magnificent, flower-filled cathedral. He spoke of duty, of aristocratic honor, and of the traditional, quiet obedience an Omega owed to her powerful alpha husband. Arthur's jaw clenched visibly at the outdated words, his massive thumb gently stroking the sensitive skin of my wrist to silently reassure me. When the crucial moment finally arrived for the exchange of our sacred wedding vows, a heavy, expectant hush fell over the thousands of watching nobles. Traditionally, the powerful Duke was supposed to remain standing tall and proudly declare his absolute ownership over his new, submissive bride. Instead, the most terrifying and powerful man in the entire kingdom did the exact opposite, sending an immediate shockwave through the stunned cathedral. Arthur gracefully dropped down onto one knee right there on the hard marble floor, bowing his dark head before me in total, willing submission. A collective, scandalous gasp ripped through the massive crowd, but Arthur completely ignored them all, keeping his burning, devoted eyes locked exclusively on mine. "I do not claim you as my property, Clara, for you have already conquered my very soul," his deep voice rang out clearly, echoing powerfully off the high-vaulted ceilings. "I solemnly swear my life, my vast fortune, and my unbreakable sword entirely to your eternal service. I promise to be your fiercest protector, your most devoted servant, and the only man who will ever be allowed to worship at your feet. You are my absolute equal, my brilliant queen, and the only light that can ever pierce my terrifying darkness." Tears of pure, unadulterated joy spilled freely down my flushed cheeks, completely ruining the flawless makeup my maids had spent hours carefully applying. I did not care about the hundreds of staring eyes, nor did I care about maintaining the perfect, icy composure he had once taught me. I squeezed his large, warm hands tightly, my voice trembling but carrying a fierce, undeniable strength of its own. "And I promise to love the man behind the terrifying legend, to hold your heart fiercely, and to never, ever let you go. I accept your devotion, Arthur, And I give you my entire soul in return, for this lifetime and every single one that follows." Arthur stood up powerfully, his magnificent eyes blazing with an intoxicating mixture of absolute triumph and overwhelming, endless love. He did not wait for the Archbishop's final, tedious blessing to officially seal the sacred wedding ceremony. He wrapped his strong arms securely around my waist and pulled me flush against his hard chest, claiming my lips in a deep, soul-shattering kiss. It was a kiss of absolute victory, a passionate declaration that the dangerous game of seduction was over and true love had miraculously won. The massive cathedral erupted into thunderous, deafening applause, the aristocratic vultures finally realizing they were witnessing the birth of an unstoppable new dynasty. As we finally broke apart, both of us breathless and smiling like glorious, happy fools, Arthur gently rested his forehead against mine. "You are finally mine, my beautiful Duchess," he murmured, his intoxicating alpha scent wrapping around me like an impenetrable, invisible shield. "And you are entirely mine, my terrifying Duke," I whispered back, completely intoxicated by the absolute certainty of our happily ever after. We turned together to face the cheering crowd, my hand resting proudly and confidently on his strong, muscular arm. I had walked into his dark estate as a desperate, terrified prey, begging to learn the ruthless secrets of high society survival. But as I looked out at the sea of bowing nobles, I knew I had successfully executed the most brilliant, daring hunt in history. I had captured the cold heart of the Iron Duke, and in doing so, I had beautifully won the entire world. 6 blissful months had passed since our spectacular royal wedding completely reshaped the social hierarchy of the entire kingdom. The dreaded winter social season had finally arrived once again, but I no longer viewed the falling snow with the paralyzing terror of a destitute Omega. Instead, I sat comfortably in front of the roaring marble fireplace inside Arthur's private study, wrapped securely in his heavy velvet dressing gown. My formidable husband was currently seated behind his massive mahogany desk, desperately trying to focus on important territorial treaties. I watched him quietly over the rim of my delicate porcelain teacup, admiring the sharp, fiercely handsome lines of his highly concentrated face. He still possessed the terrifying aura of the legendary Iron Duke to the outside world, a ruthless man who commanded entire armies with a single cold glare. But within the heavily guarded, impossibly warm walls of our private estate, that terrifying monster belonged entirely and exclusively to me. I slowly lowered my teacup back to the polished silver tray, a wicked, playful idea suddenly blooming brightly in my relaxed mind. It was time to test exactly how well I remembered the very first, agonizing lessons my dark master had ever meticulously taught me. I deliberately shifted my weight on the plush leather sofa, letting the heavy velvet gown slip just slightly off one of my bare shoulders. Across the large room, the rhythmic scratching of Arthur's gold-tipped quill abruptly stopped, signaling his immediate, instinctual awareness of my slight movement. I did not look directly at him, perfectly remembering his strict, unyielding rule about creating the maddening illusion of innocent, unintentional distraction. Instead, I tilted my head back to gaze thoughtfully at the painted ceiling, intentionally exposing the long, delicate, and highly vulnerable line of my pale throat. I clearly heard a soft, sudden intake of breath coming from the direction of the heavy mahogany desk. The intoxicating, heavy scent of dark pine needles in the room spiked instantly, growing significantly warmer and undeniably richer. I allowed a tiny, secretive smile to play across my lips before I carefully arranged my features back into an expression of serene, oblivious boredom. Slowly, I lifted my hand and began to twirl a loose, dark curl of my hair around my finger with deliberate, mesmerizing slowness. "Clara," Arthur's deep, vibrating baritone finally broke the heavy silence of the study, carrying a distinct edge of rough, barely contained warning. I turned my head to look at him with wide, perfectly executed doe eyes, fluttering my eyelashes with exactly the right amount of feigned innocence. "Yes, my lord?" I murmured softly, intentionally dropping my voice to a breathless, completely submissive whisper that I knew drove him completely insane. A low, feral growl rumbled deep within his broad, muscular chest as his icy blue eyes darkened rapidly with unmistakable, consuming hunger. He stood up from his chair with the terrifying, predatory grace of a starving wolf preparing to completely devour his chosen prey. He abandoned the vital political treatise completely, stalking across the expensive Persian rug until he was towering impressively over my seated figure. You are deliberately utilizing the phase 2 distraction techniques I explicitly taught you in this very room, he accused, his voice thick with a chaotic mix of amusement and heavy desire. I gasped softly, forcing my breathing to become slightly rapid and shallow, perfectly mimicking the panicked flutter of a hopelessly trapped bird. I have absolutely no idea what you are talking about, Your Grace, I lied sweetly, looking up at him with an angelic, entirely guiltless expression. Arthur let out a breathless, defeated laugh, resting his massive, rough hands firmly on the back of the sofa on either side of my head to cage me in. You are a wicked, merciless little creature, completely weaponizing my own tactical instructions against my rapidly crumbling sanity. He leaned down incredibly slowly, his warm, mint-scented breath brushing tantalizingly against the highly sensitive skin of my freshly exposed collarbone. And the most agonizing part of this entire situation is that it still works flawlessly on me every single damn time. I reached up fearlessly, tangling my fingers deeply into the soft, dark hair at the nape of his neck to pull his handsome face closer to mine. You were the one who arrogantly claimed that a powerful alpha must be made to believe he is the Grand Hunter, I reminded him with a triumphant, wicked smirk. You told me the ultimate victory comes from making him totally oblivious right up until the exact moment the steel cage snaps irrevocably shut. Arthur buried his face deeply into the crook of my neck, inhaling my sweet omega scent with a desperate, starving, endless devotion. The cage snapped shut on my foolish heart the very first day you bravely walked into this dark study and demanded I teach you, he confessed softly against my warm skin. I was absolutely doomed from the very first moment I looked into your terrified, incredibly beautiful eyes and realized I wanted to protect you. I smiled warmly, my entire heart swelling with an overwhelming, absolute certainty of his endless, unconditional love for me. He swept me effortlessly up into his strong arms, lifting me from the leather sofa as if I weighed absolutely nothing at all. The demanding political treaties, the endless social obligations of the aristocracy, and the entire outside world vanished completely as he carried me toward our private bedchambers. He kissed me with the exact same fierce, demanding passion he had shown in that rain-swept carriage, offering a devastating promise of a lifetime of worship. I melted willingly against his hard, muscular chest, knowing completely and utterly that I was exactly where I was always meant to be. The terrifying Iron Duke had meticulously taught me every single dark secret to perfectly seducing and completely destroying a powerful man. But the most beautiful, poetic irony of our magnificent love story was that I never actually had to use those deceptive tricks to win his heart. His cold, impenetrable armor had not been pierced by my calculated glances or by my expertly feigned innocence. It had been completely shattered by a desperate, ruined girl who accidentally managed to awaken the fiercely protective, wildly loving soul hidden deep beneath his violent scars. I had initially come to him seeking the sharp, dangerous weapons of a seasoned predator just to survive my tragic, impending fate. Instead, I had miraculously discovered the absolute, intoxicating joy of becoming his most cherished, eternally loved prize. As he gently laid me down upon the plush velvet pillows, his dark eyes shining with absolute, undeniable reverence, I pulled my magnificent husband down for another breathtaking kiss. He was undeniably the strongest, most dangerous alpha in the entire kingdom, an absolute force of nature that stubbornly bowed to no living king. But as he happily surrendered to my soft touch, groaning deeply against my eager lips, I finally knew the ultimate, beautiful truth of our dangerous game. He may have successfully taught me how to ruthlessly seduce the entire world, but he was always destined to be my first, and absolutely only, willing victim.